What if Jack and Jill never fell, rather were pushed down the hill? What if the big bad wolf saved Red Riding Hood from the huntsman in the woods? Maybe Hansel and Gretel were not heroic after all, especially since they pushed an innocent elderly woman into an oven, claiming to have killed a witch. The main premise in the Curse of the Werewolf as well as the Werewolf and Reaper series stemmed from those anomalies. What if the fairy tales we've grown up with had been lived out in another world, with twists and turns that only dared to live in our imagination? For bizarre things to happen like talking werewolves that cannot revert to their human selves despite lunar cycles, a vampire cop working in his local police station during the night shifts, struggling to fit in, witches on the side of human folk that practice elemental magic rather than curses. And one such fairy tale in the strange dark timeline has given rise to Death himself, a fairy tale that started it all, known as Rumpelstiltskin. What I have done with Rumpelstiltskin is fused folklore with fairy tale. Nobody in 1812 till now, at least not any that had been documented, has written Rumpelstiltskin to be a demon or at least explicitly stated it. And that's exactly what I've made him in the story. The common folklore regarding demons and their deals correlates to their mysterious nature. A demon operated freely and with power as long as its name was unknown. Once named, it becomes bound and loses its leverage. Such was the main concept behind the fairy tale. Long ago, Rumpelstiltskin as a goblin imp traveled to the human land, unleashing his trickery upon human folk. One such person that he visited was the miller's daughter, Seraphine, locked in a castle with impossible tasks to complete just because of her boastful father's false claims of what his daughter was capable of doing. So, on the first night, he spins straw into gold in exchange for her necklace. She pays with the only object she has. Second night, same deal, larger room in exchange for her ring. The king kept escalating the amount of straw, greedy for more. Third night, he spins one final room of straw into gold in exchange for her firstborn child. She has nothing left to trade, so the king promises that his son the prince would marry her if she succeeded this last time, and she promises Rumpelstiltskin the child since her reputation of not only herself but her father as well hangs in the balance. Of course, these deals would fall off if she knew the imp's name, something that no one knew at the time. Then he vanishes after the deal while she becomes the princess and has a child. He is absent for a vast period of time in the original fairy tale, which I have replaced with his true nature and the reveal of his home, the underworld. My depiction of Rumpelstiltskin is a short, decayed goblin with large pointy ears, foul teeth, and mischievous eyes. He walks with a cane and has a severe hunch. As he traverses through dungeons, fiery pits, forbidden chambers, and dark hallways, he reaches a throne in the underworld of which he comfortably and proudly sits on. There were monsters that could trample him by mistake, creatures that could devour him without a moment's hesitation, and demon war chiefs that could have him killed by simply snapping their fingers, but they can't. Monsters they may be, but fools they are not, especially when dealing with the king of the underworld. When Rumpelstiltskin sat on his throne, his hands stole the focus. I have written him to wear large, heavy rings on every finger, starting from just above the knuckle all the way to the fingertips. When his fingers held no more rings, he removes them and keeps them in a drawer, revealing more rings than one could count. These rings carried every deal he has ever made, not just with human folk but with the monsters in the underworld as well. Back to the human land, Seraphine marries the king's son, but also falls in love with him, gives birth, and seemingly forgets Rumpelstiltskin, until he returns on that dark, stormy night to collect what had been promised. In the original fairy tale, for this particular part, the queen outsmarted the imp by finding out his name when he danced around a small campfire in the woods, singing a song that revealed his identity, boasting about his trickery. Though, not in this version. When Rumpelstiltskin returned, he snatched away the princess's firstborn, whom she named Dagon. However, it turned out she did know the imp's name, just never had the opportunity to reveal it to him. In a tragic, heartbreaking plea for help, the Princess Seraphine ran through towns, villages, and the vast woods itself, searching for the imp to reveal his name to him, to no avail. Her child had been taken, a child whom she never thought she would love. However, Seraphine wasn't the first victim that succumbed to the imp's trickery. The story reveals a terrifying ending of Rumpelstiltskin, repeating the same trick with 3 other women in exchange for their firstborns. Then, in a small wooden cabin, after the goblin had succeeded in his malice, he smiled upon the 4 newborns that were now his. Caecilius, Pharaoh, Wilbert, and Dagon were the original birth names given to them. Though not only did Rumpelstiltskin bestow upon them great power, he also gifted them names fitting for their cause, names he would use to control the world in every timeline, thus giving rise to the 4 riders of the apocalypse: conquest, famine, war, and death, respectively. Time in the underworld worked differently compared to the human land. One could live an entire lifetime in there with only a few hours passing by in the real world. Among the 4 children, Dagon was placed into purgatory, a place that existed for souls that had not yet been allocated for heaven or hell. There were monsters most foul of all shapes and sizes, along with a few fallen angels and some demon souls as well. Dagon's job was an easy one on paper: fetch the souls of the deceased in any timeline and bring them to purgatory for sorting. However, no one fully knew just how much had been scraped away from his own body, carrying not only the weight of the souls but also the burdens humans carried before their death. No one understood how heavy souls really were, especially the young that had been gone too soon, or the old that still had so much to try for. Folk in the underworld began calling him the Reaper of Souls, or simply Death. Yet Dagon had no say who lived or died. He was merely a messenger and a transporter. As he grew up, his own soul had begun slipping away, tearing the flesh away from his once human face. Death had become a gaunt figure and the personification of darkness. His eye sockets were so hollow that one would be frightened to look into the darkness consuming them. They felt like they were looking into the abyss. Therefore, both human and supernatural beings avoided direct eye contact with the Reaper, except for one person whom you all know, Ragnar Liefsson. Many believed him to cause actual death. He had been seen as the bearer of bad omens, unfortunate events, and downright evil just because of his job. A misunderstanding, of course, but he accepted a life with strange powers given to him, for he had no other choice or guidance. Death was different compared to his siblings, not just in his appearance but in his mannerisms as well. His siblings never questioned how they were born or ended up in the underworld. They just lived their lives in there. Dagon, on the other hand, always wanted to know more. Unlike the rewards received by his siblings to follow, either an ally or a weapon, Rumpelstiltskin refrained from doing so with the Reaper, for he had grown far too powerful in such a short space of time. Meanwhile, he assumed the same for his siblings that lived in their own dungeons in hell. He knew them as Caecilius, Pharaoh, and Wilbert, but much like himself, they had been referred to as conquest, famine, and war respectively. While Death rarely spent time with them, he loved and cared for them deeply, regarding them as his real siblings as he didn't know the truth. His rebellious nature of poking his skeletal nose in matters of the underworld was never just for him to escape, but for his siblings as well. Conquest growing up had always been the weaker siblings in terms of strength. His physicality was actually less than that of an average mortal man. Because of this, he was an easy target for the monsters in hell. They would pass their remarks at him, push him around, and disrespected him compared to his siblings. His pale scarred skin and glowing blue eyes didn't help his cause either. However, Conquest never wanted death, famine, or war to come to his aid. While he lacked the physical strength to defend himself, he had been gifted with power far scarier than the rest. Conquest knew what to say, when to say it, and how to do so. His words and sentences would sound so eloquent, without raising suspicion of planting the seeds of doubt. He could manipulate anyone, including his siblings. In doing so, he became the master manipulator, reaching a level of intellect that very few could achieve. Through his evil deeds of convincing great kings to sacrifice their souls to hell, Rumpelstiltskin rewarded Conquest with an ally to make up for his lack of strength, a monster that became his pet, known as the Beast of Burdock Mountain. The Beast of Burdock Mountain was a terrifying creature that lived in the city of Arkborn. Not often do monsters make Ragnar Liefsson look small. The neat trick Conquest had mastered was to only make the Beast of Burdock Mountain visible to him and his siblings. For others, they would feel its presence and smell its foul breath, but they would see nothing. How frightening it is to be ripped apart into a million pieces by something you cannot see. In addition, he also created a whip for stronger enemies that needed more piercing in their minds. Therefore, the whip was used as a mind cleanser, emptying their own thoughts to make room for conquests. In time, the city of Arkborn, existing in another timeline, became Conquest Void, a rich city that he ruled over with human folk bending to his will. Pharaoh, on the other hand, spent most of her time practicing darker forms of chemistry and microbiology in her dungeon. Death assumed his sister's duty was to cure famine and sickness, hence her nickname, not realizing that she had been the one to cause those things. Having visited many timelines, she obtained the knowledge and the resources to create viruses that had no known cure for them. Famine would visit the human land in random timelines, poisoning livestock, spreading plagues across towns and villages, witnessing the fall of humanity before her green eyes. With every human or creature that died from famine's plagues, she would get stronger. These souls were not triggered for the Reaper to collect. More so, she had learned the ability to summon the people she snatched away, though only in their skeletal form. They would walk slow and wobbly, giving off an appearance of weakness, when in reality they were controlled by a portion of her power. Due to Famine's evil work in the human lands, Rumpelstiltskin rewarded her with a horse, though it was far from an ordinary animal. In fact, no one besides a select few knew the horse was no animal, rather Famine's shape-shifting Wendigo, an entity that personified insatiable hunger, fitting for her cause. Much like Dagon and Conquest, Famine's once beautiful appearance had changed over the course of her life. Her skin became paler with a tint that matched her glowing green eyes. Her teeth had become rotten and foul, and her fingernails had more dirt caked under them than one could imagine. However, Famine was Rumpelstiltskin's second favorite. He did favor one of the children the most, the first newborn he had taken. While the riders of the apocalypse were far larger than the average human, Wilbeth was by far the largest. Growing to 15 feet, War became the titan that walked among demon war chiefs, sharing the same height. Whenever he traveled the human land, his presence snatched away peace from human folk, hence his nickname. He removed calm and safety from timelines, replacing them with chaos and inciting bloodshed. Wilbeth got along with Conquest as both carried out the same ordeals, just at different scales and methods. However, Wilbeth partook in the battles he caused not because he had been commanded to, because he enjoyed it. Rumpelstiltskin gifted him a warhammer that was almost the size of him, a weapon so heavy that only War could use it. He wears a long black cloak like the Reaper, with an iron mask covering his face as well as iron gloves and boots. Due to how quickly War took control of not only the underworld, but hell as well, Rumpelstiltskin further gifted him with a pet known as Monolith, the dragon of all dragons. Every battlefield War passed through was never empty afterwards. The fallen warriors, innocent folk that had been slaughtered by the spoils of war, or even wounded horses, had become the dragon's meal. So while all this lore and the characters in the underworld as well as how the riders of the apocalypse function may be interesting to some, the story itself takes a drastic turn. And this is where I recap Book 1 and some of Book 2 that I have already uploaded in chronological order. I say chronological because when I wrote book 1, it was in a form of non-linear storytelling. That just means I jump from the present to the past quite often. I normally don't like doing that, however, for a series with so much lore involved, that was the best possible option. Death was the only one to visit more timelines compared to his siblings. Naturally, he learned more about the human world than anyone else. His mission to rebel against the underworld to destroy it began on that dark, rainy night in the human land. When a person was about to die, the Reaper feels a vibrational hum in his hollow chest. Then he looks at the timelines in purgatory, scattered throughout the void like a giant, never-ending tree. When an orb within the timeline vibrates, then he knew which land to visit. However, on this particular night, he never expected to find out the truth. He never thought he would see his biological mother, Seraphine. In the video titled The Grim Reaper's Past, The Dark Secret of the Grigori, there is a chapter explaining said incident. When the Reaper traveled to the human land in the same timeline that he was born in, he saw a little girl sitting on a bench. The chapter explains the sorrow and grief Death felt whenever he had to take a soul, especially one belonging to a sickly child. Despite experiencing the pain many a times, he never got used to it. There was never a specific method to approach the situation, and even after eons, it felt like his first day on the job. The Reaper struck a conversation with a girl named Isabel, trying to make the situation far less scarier than what it would turn out to be. She told him how she sat on the bench every night because her father had been working multiple jobs to put her through school since her mother passed away. The Reaper cried when he heard the girl's story, but the hood of his cloak cast a shadow upon his skeletal face, hiding his tears from not only the little girl but the night itself. She eventually told the Reaper she felt rather tired and wished to rest her head onto his shoulder for a while. She also told him if she fell asleep he should wake her up when her father returned. It was a gut-wrenching experience for Death, one that caused pain so deep that he felt it in his bones. When she took her last breath, he gently carried her soul in his palm, beginning to walk away and leave the human land. However, there was commotion in the village he was in. An old woman living a life of poverty and grief ran through the village like a crazy woman. She cried out, hitting her own chest, grabbing her tattered rags for clothes in desperation and turmoil. The Reaper, completely hidden from human folk, stood idly by, watching the woman in confusion. He felt a strange connection, almost like he knew her without actually knowing her. He overheard the crowded village folk whispering in their gossip. "Oh no, it's her again," they said. Such a tragic life this woman had chosen. The village folk knew her name to be Seraphine, a princess that had forsaken her life of luxury and riches in the castle, searching for her son for all these years. She had become a beggar, but folk referred to her as the crazy woman for what she would say in every town and village she would pass through. Death walked closer. He couldn't shake off this feeling no matter how much he tried. He reached his hand out to the woman from afar without even realizing he did so. And then she says, "Have you seen my son? My boy, my child, have you seen him? He took my child. He broke his deal and he took my child. I knew the imp's name. I heard his name when he danced around the campfire in the woods. Rumpelstiltskin. Rumpelstiltskin was his name. Give me back my boy." Death stood frozen. Having lived in purgatory observing timelines, murmurs and gossip traveled fast even in the underworld. He heard it before, but he never believed it, nor could he prove it. Many in the underworld said the riders of the apocalypse were stolen newborns from the human land. However, just a rumor it remained. With the soul in his hand vibrating and glitching, the Reaper had to return to purgatory before the soul gets lost in transit. When he returned and delivered the soul safely, allocating it to heaven, he studied the timeline Seraphine was in. He followed the past, witnessing the events that transpired, and saw that old woman from princess to beggar was not crazy after all. She was telling the truth about the goblin imp. Seraphine was indeed Dagon's mother. he saw how Rumpelstiltskin snatched him away along with 3 other newborns. Death wanted to meet his so-called father Rumpelstiltskin. However, the goblin imp nor his siblings were around, almost like they avoided Death, knowing he had begun piecing everything together. Though his discovery had been more horrific than that. Death opened a book, larger and heavier than any book that existed in the human world. Stories, fables, poems, ancient literature, and fairy tales for particular timelines were recorded and observed to keep stability for the course of events to follow. He noticed how the usual tellings of fairy tales had been altered in the timeline that he was born in. He noticed how prophecies were written and currently being played out like scenes from a movie, following a script. But who wrote the prophecies still remained a mystery. One such prophecy spoke about 3 special class werewolves said to be created in that land, men who would be cursed with a permanent form of lycanthropy. 1 to destroy the Valzari or the fallen angels now working for Hell, 1 to destroy the underworld, and 1 to destroy Hell itself. Death's eyes glowed red when he focused on the second one, the werewolf to destroy the underworld, a man whom the Reaper did not know yet, a man going by the name of Ragnar Liefsson. Ragnar Liefsson, the White Wolf, has been one of the most loved characters among my audience. Whichever story that I write him in, I feel that presence that he carries, that aura and the power he holds, and I'm sure the audience does too. Ragnar was a descendant of giants. Standing at 2 meters tall, he was the largest warrior knight that ever lived. He had long blonde hair and a beard with more scars on his face than actual clear skin. However, his size did not hinder him in battle. The warrior knight moved with such fluidity that one would compare his movements to an elf. He didn't just wield the sword, he became one with it. But what made Ragnar so frightening was his ability to read an opponent's moves. He never minded losing the first round of a fight, studying his opponents, the way they inhaled before a strike and exhaled after, the way their eyes flickered during battle. Their footwork, reflexes, hesitance in their posture had all been studied by Ragnar Liefsson in the heat of battle. Through many wars, Ragnar befriended a dwarven war chief known as Berthold. Many believed the dwarf from the land of Freya, northwest of the Harrow, to be weaker and slower than the other warriors, but they were sorely mistaken. If anything, Berthold rivaled Ragnar in terms of strength many a times. Having fought many battles together, the bond of friendship turned into brotherhood. After a while, Ragnar stepped away from serving kings. He took notice to how smaller towns and villages were struggling with monsters invading their lands. Hence, he founded and joined a group called the Night Watch. The Night Watch consisted of 7 of the greatest warrior knights that took contracts from notice boards, helping people in need. Often, most villages and towns never had enough to compensate them, but the Night Watch never cared. They felt like they were actually doing good by making a difference where and when it mattered. Ragnar Liefsson was a fearsome leader that not only delegated orders in the heat of battle, but also admitted when he was wrong and tried to learn from warriors less skilled than him. Those skills never just bestowed upon him by the gods. That came from a lifetime of battles, since Ragnar Liefsson had picked up a sword when he was a mere child. When he grew up, children in his village never had the luxury to receive an education. When they were capable enough to wield a sword and hold a shield up high, they would be chosen to fight in battle. In doing so, Ragnar Liefsson was unable to read or write. But that would soon change. When Ragnar was in his 20s, he met a beautiful woman with long red curly hair that lived in a village he worked in, a local school teacher going by the name Luna. Most women and men dared not approach Ragnar Liefsson for how terrifying he looked. His sheer size alone would frighten people, followed by the cold look in his blue eyes and the scars on his face. Though not Luna. And the Night Watch loved the dynamic of seeing their fearless leader bend to the will of a woman. Luna was a rather short woman who was almost half the size of Ragnar. She was the only person the warrior knight shied away from. He refused to make eye contact with her, and whenever he spoke to her, his hands would always be behind his back, except for the times when he would rub them together in nervousness. Luna was the complete opposite of Ragnar. She was joyful, snarky, loud, and just an absolute pleasure to be around. She lived life like it was her last day on Earth every day, with an attitude and personality that became contagious. His life from soil and dirt had now changed to an evergreen garden, with the most beautiful flowers blossoming in the sunshine. Time with its generous passing had married Ragnar and Luna, birthing their beloved boy Maximus. Because Luna had been a teacher, the boy had received education at the highest level. At times when Luna taught him, Ragnar would listen in. The warrior knight, much like his son, had learned how to read and write, though for Ragnar there was still a long way to go. Nevertheless, his life felt like a dream. Everything worked out for the better, a life that he never thought would be possible. However, as the prophecy stated, this life of happiness for Ragnar Liefsson would be short-lived. When Maximus was in his early teens, Ragnar received a contract through word of mouth. There was a village on the west side of the land known as the Harrow, rumored to be in danger from an attack to take place at night. Ragnar and the Night Watch found it strange that protection had been asked from them before anything could happen. It was also rather suspicious for the village folk to provide accommodation for the warrior knights and their families, something that rarely happened. Nevertheless, coin was always needed, and if the safety of others hung in a balance, then the Night Watch would see it through. Ragnar and his family moved to the village of Harrow to stay the night. Usually, Luna never accompanied her husband as she had school to teach, but on this particular day she had an ominous feeling crawling through her chest. She felt like something terrible was going to happen to the love of her life and her precious boy. Things were also quite tense between Ragnar and Luna, since she wanted him to stop fighting and retire from the warrior life. She felt like he had done enough for the people in this land, but he never agreed. Truth be told, Ragnar didn't know how to do anything else but fight. The Night Watch patrolled the village asking their routine questions and received no response. The behavior from the village folk raised suspicion, almost like they fabricated a story just to meet the Night Watch in person and bathe in the glory of their presence. They even paid the warriors before the job was done, which had been even stranger. From what the Night Watch had seen, the homes were quite simple and small. The villagers looked sickly and rather pale, wearing tattered clothing. Where did they get so much coin from? Meanwhile, Luna made the small wooden cabin into a temporary home. Maximus was well taken care of and Ragnar patrolled the village. When Luna hung the clothes outside late afternoon, she could not help but notice the gigantic stone wall in the village that seemed to touch the sky. Now, for those who have found my channel or the series through the Vampire Cop Book 2, this was the stone wall the final battle between Filion and the Crown took place behind. Luna heard a knocking sound behind the stone wall. She walked towards it and peeped through the large cracks and crevices. Her eyes widened in horror. Behind the stone wall was the largest graveyard she had ever seen. There were more tombstones than the entire population of some towns and villages. She saw an old, decayed woman with a severe hunch wearing a black hooded cloak, walking to random graves. The old woman then tapped the tombstones 3 times with her walking stick, while muttering something Luna did not recognize to be English. Suddenly, the graves would tremble and the tombstones would sway. The witch's ritual had been momentarily interrupted when Luna leaned against the stone wall with too much pressure. The old woman heard debris falling and crumbling from the large cracks and crevices, spotting Luna before she could move away. Suddenly, within a blink of an eye, still in a hunched posture, the old witch ran towards the stone wall as Luna backed away, falling to the ground in fear. The witch showed her decayed face through the cracks as it changed from human to monster. Luna frantically got up to her feet, running home without looking back. When she closed the door behind her, catching her breath, she made haste to tell Ragnar what she saw, but she had been interrupted. The villagers were standing behind their windows inside their homes, looking frightening as ever. Their smiles were so wide it looked like their jaws were broken. They gestured to Luna to keep quiet while pointing at Maximus inside the house. Then it struck Luna, something that was so obvious this entire time, but she nor Ragnar noticed it. Maximus was the only child in the village. Where were all the other children? Just as night arrived, the village was attacked. Undead creatures swarmed the harrow, moving like they were possessed. Ragnar and the Night Watch fought them off, though not easily. There were hordes of them sprouting out of nowhere, not realizing they were resurrected behind the stone wall. Ragnar could not help but notice how the undead humanoid creatures never attacked any of the villagers. Even those who were still outside their homes were left untouched by the undead. Their sole focus was on the Night Watch. When the Night Watch won the Battle of Harrow, Ragnar Liefsson looked down at one of the humanoid creatures he had slain. There was a name tag on the body, a name that he had recognized. It was one of the teachers Luna had worked with, who had sadly passed away not too long ago. When morning arrived, Ragnar planned to leave the village. Luna tried to tell him what she saw, but the villagers were always nearby, keeping a close eye on Maximus to snatch him away. The warrior knight took her silence for illness and left with Maximus to get medication from the local chemist. When Luna was left alone, the villagers barged into a house, kidnapping her. They told her that they needed Ragnar and Maximus, not her. They dragged her out of her home and kept her locked away into a storage basement downstairs in one of the homes. When Ragnar and Maximus returned, the villagers handed him a fabricated letter that Luna supposedly wrote, mentioning that she left the warrior knight for someone else. Maximus helped Ragnar to read the letter since he struggled. This was an affair going on for some time apparently, and she could not stay with Ragnar or her son anymore. Ragnar, absolutely furious by this, not only because of the betrayal but also the abandonment of their son, took Maximus into the woods gathering firewood for the remainder of their stay in the winter. The Night Watch joined Ragnar shortly with one of them missing, Ingrid, the only woman in the Night Watch. When he asked his team where she was, he found out they had killed her. The villagers bribed the remaining Night Watch with more gold than they had ever seen in their entire lives. When Ingrid tried fighting them off and tell her captain about the betrayal, they killed her and dumped her body into the river. Ragnar, irate, fought the Night Watch with a heavy heart and a clouded mind. But to his surprise, a portal opened up in the woods. A demon with glowing red eyes that made Ragnar Liefsson look small walked through. His aura was so foul that the trees in the woods began to wither and crumble. The demon chased Maximus while a wounded Ragnar had slain his fellow warriors that he once trusted with his life. The warrior knight then moved his attention to the demon, fighting bravely but inevitably failing. However, the demon never killed Ragnar, rather cursed him. With a foul incantation, the warrior knight underwent a painful transformation from human to werewolf. In excruciating pain, Ragnar in his werewolf form had been dropped down to one knee, panting on the ground, while Maximus begged and cried for his father to save him from the demon's grasp. The demon then commanded Ragnar to obey him, something demons have done many times when they created werewolves. They were mindless beasts that would lose all their memories, speech and mannerisms and blindly follow their master. But not this time. Ragnar retained all his memories. He listened to the demon, giving an illusion of loyalty till he got close enough and sliced its ankle with his sharp werewolf claws. In anger and pain, the demon retreated with Maximus, though barely jumping into the portal, leaving the human land. Ragnar Liefsson jumped into the portal a few seconds after before it closed, not knowing they would end up in hell. However, the demon never knew he had committed a grave mistake. They assumed prophecies were just fables, stories that someone wrote when they were bored. There had been a werewolf sharing the same capabilities before Ragnar's time, the first werewolf of the prophecy. But that was so long ago that the monster never realized when he cursed Ragnar, he would give rise to the 8-foot-tall werewolf that everyone would later fear, a werewolf that would build his reputation as the White Wolf. With each passing minute in hell, Ragnar Liefsson had grown stronger. When he walked through hell searching for his son, he stumbled upon a dungeon. Through a gap in the door, he saw Maximus unconscious, hovering in the air while the demon and his minions performed a ritual. Ragnar stormed the dungeon, slaying the lesser demons and creatures with such ferocity and pure terror. The way he moved as a warrior knight was now amplified, packed behind a mountain of strength and lightning speed. His eyes turned red, and with each monster he killed in that dungeon, they smoldered like molten lava. In a vicious and dramatic leap, the White Wolf took a massive claw swipe with so much power and force, the demon never realized his head had been sliced off its monstrous body. Ragnar Liefsson then quickly grabbed Maximus, carrying the boy with one arm, while the demon's head had been in the other. With creatures most foul of all shapes and sizes alerted by the commotion in hell, chasing Ragnar and his son, the White Wolf held the demon's severed head in front, opening up the portal back to the human land. However, when the White Wolf ended up back in the woods with Maximus in his arms, the boy had taken his last breath. Ragnar in his werewolf form had been strong enough to endure the gravity and force not only from hell but the portal itself, whereas for Maximus, his body had previously suffered so much from the ritual in hell, as well as it being too small and weak to withstand the portal pressure gradient. With the Night Watch betraying him, his wife supposedly leaving him for another man, and now the body of his son carried in his arms, Ragnar Liefsson had been filled with emptiness. He walked to the village of Harrow to perform a proper burial for his precious boy, only to find the villagers celebrating. They danced in a weird way, chanting their foul language like the ritual in hell, while bathing in the gold given to them, courtesy of the old witch behind the stone wall and the demon himself. The villagers of Harrow were evil to their core. The reason Maximus was the only child in the village was because they had sacrificed their own in exchange for wealth. With Ragnar's hearing intensified to the point of a whisper stinging his werewolf ears, he heard everything. The crone Luna had seen, along with the villagers of Harrow, used Ragnar as a pawn and his son as a sacrificial lamb. Hell needed the strongest warrior to bend to their will, working for them, killing for them. He locked eyes with the crone Esme standing in the village celebrating with the villagers, though the witch never expected for Ragnar to return, at least not as a werewolf who retained his memories. In sheer panic and fear, the witch dissipated into the air, fleeing the village, leaving the villagers behind without saying anything, almost like she knew the monster their actions had unleashed. Ragnar, however, caught a whiff of Luna's perfume. His sense of smell picked up scents that his human self never could. He followed the scent to a storage basement beneath one of the village houses. When he stepped in, he placed the body of his son onto a wooden table before further entering the basement, and there he saw his wife hanging from a chain. Ragnar ran towards Luna, lifting her up to loosen the tension of the chain, a desperate effort, but his wife was no more. He held her in his arms and cried. The story reveals how broken Ragnar was in that moment, how his heart turned to stone. There was a letter kept on one of the wooden tables. The werewolf recognized his wife's writing. Luna's letter was probably the most heartbreaking moment in the entire series at the time. It read, "My dear Ragnar, I swear to you whatever these evil people told you that I didn't do it. I wish I told you earlier about them and none of this would have happened. They said they would take Maximus and sacrifice him in a ritual if I spoke. Despite me not talking, they still took me captive. The village folk untied me and told me it was completed. My son Maximus was dead and my beloved husband was now a servant of hell. A small part of me never believed that, and this is what the letter is for. If what they say is not true, then I know you will find me. I have always loved you and I am so sorry. I wanted you to stop fighting. I wanted us to be farmers after this last battle and grow the freshest crops in all the land so no child would ever sleep hungry at night. Though if what they say is true, I cannot live a life without you and our dear boy in it. I'm not strong like you. I will always be your moon, lighting up the darkest of nights, and our dear boy Maximus will be the brightest star in the sky, always encouraging you to move forward. In this lifetime and the next, I, Ragnar Liefsson, will always belong to you. Goodbye, my dear Ragnar." This was the moment in the story when Ragnar's eyes glowed red and never changed afterwards. A switch had been flipped where his humanity had been scraped away from his soul. The villagers were still oblivious to the monstrous werewolf lurking in their village. Ragnar carried Luna and Maximus to their temporary home on the mountaintop of the Harrow, out of sight from the villagers. Then he traveled back to the woods to retrieve the demon's head he had severed and stuck it on the village sign that said, "Welcome to the Harrow." It was only then did the villagers see the werewolf. Their eyes and body flickered and trembled with fear, knowing the creature they served, prayed to, sacrificed to, had been slaughtered by the White Wolf. Ragnar Liefsson, in the most horrific and brutal way possible, had eradicated the village folk of Harrow. The river of their blood flowed through the village without any signs of stopping. He eventually piled their bodies and limbs at the entrance of the village, blocking it entirely. While not as high as the stone wall, the limbs and bodies provided a barricade to prevent anyone from entering. The story ends with a heartbreaking moment that took place at night. There were two graves next to the wooden house Ragnar lived in on the mountaintop, with makeshift tombstones and the names of Luna and Maximus written on them. The werewolf sat on the rock by the village lake of the Harrow. Though he struggled and struggled, he eventually read every single word of Luna's letter. Ragnar then looks at the full moon and the brightest star in the night sky, howling so loudly that it echoed throughout the entire land. Looking back, this was one of the strongest stories that I have written on this channel. And even after a couple years doing a lore recap of the series, the tale of Ragnar's origin still holds its own to this day. A couple years go by for Ragnar the White Wolf living in an empty village. He was labeled as the Butcher of Harrow who killed innocent villagers in his werewolf form due to his bloodlust, as outsiders never knew the truth. It was easier for people to accuse the 8-foot-tall monster with glowing red eyes than to hold human folk accountable for their evil deeds. He became a myth, the monster that abandoned the village house living in a cave towards the mountaintop. For the most part, that was true, but Ragnar had been busy. Ragnar tried searching for the old witch he saw that dark day in the Harrow. He had nightmares about the incident involving his wife and son, nightmares that never seemed to stop. In the interim, Bertel, the dwarven war chief, visited Ragnar frequently, checking up on his dear friend. The dwarf constantly offers Ragnar a place to stay in the land of Freya, with fortresses meticulously crafted by the dwarven warriors of old. But the White Wolf refuses. Despite the village being a curse to him, it was the place he buried his wife and son. This was the only way that he could still be close to them. When the White Wolf takes a stroll in the woods of Redwater after a nightmare, he stumbled upon an old beggar sitting on a wooden tree log. Usually, whenever folk caught a glimpse of the White Wolf, they would run away in fear, though not this old man. Ragnar found it strange at first until he noticed the man's eyes were white and murky. The stranger reveals he is blind and tends to know everything about the werewolf's life, including his tragic past. Ragnar, weary of the stranger, sits down next to him. Old and blind he may be, but the White Wolf knew how dangerous it would be to let his guard down. If the old man tried any form of supernatural trickery, the White Wolf could easily take his head off. Nevertheless, the old man named Engelbert reveals himself to be a soothsayer. He tells Ragnar about how the dark path he is traveling on, searching for the crowns, is only going to get him killed, or worse. He told the White Wolf that another werewolf just like him will be born a century from now. For Ragnar Liefsson, even if he wasn't a werewolf, he would have lived to that age anyway. The bloodline of giants were gifted with long life, and now the werewolf genes extended that period. When that time came, Ragnar should help the Grey Werewolf in his quest in order to get to the crowns. It sounded so foolish at first, but when Ragnar realized just how much the strange man knew about him, he could not help but wonder if there was any truth in that matter. Of course, Engelbert told a lie in that moment, for he was no blind beggar, rather death himself. The Reaper couldn't tell Ragnar the truth about the underworld, at least not yet. From this point onwards in the series, the Grim Reaper had to make sure that everything that happened regarding Ragnar Liefsson went according to the prophecy written about him. A slight detour or even a wrong choice could change the timeline entirely. The chapter ends when the White Wolf walks away as the old beggar stands behind foliage, changing from human to Reaper. However, we see Death now has his sight, something that he didn't have in the underworld before. So for now, I shall leave you with the next two stories that take place within the 100-year gap. These stories you're about to listen to sheds light on how Ragnar met Eleanor, the Elf Lord, and how the Elven Archer formed an alliance with the Dwarven Warchief. Since Eleanor appears in Book 2, her backstory and Ragnar's meeting with her serves as a crucial part of lore for the Werewolf and Reaper series. The second story will provide you with the monster prophecy, explaining what a special class werewolf is, who the ancient vampires were according to Elvish folklore, and the first time the Reaper knew this was the timeline he could finally taste victory in. This will conclude part 1 of the lore breakdown for the Werewolf and Reaper series. Next week I shall upload part 2 recapping how Victor Humbridge came about, as well as how Ragnar and Death defeated Conquest, the Beast of Burdock Mountain, Famine, the Wendigo Horse, and Monolith, the Dragon from Hell. I understand it may be frustrating for some who already know what's going on in the series, but since I've uploaded the Werewolf and Reaper so long ago, I would like to get everyone on track before I start Book 2. I cannot leave out Victor Humbridge or Belru Caesar without diving into Ragnar and Death's story and vice versa. When characters show up in Book 2 such as Myra the Witch of Redwater or Takarot, a character I've written in the series based on my loyal subscriber, Taker 1993, or even Mondrog the Hellhound and Lancelot the Goblin, I would like for everyone, long-time listeners and new subscribers, to be able to enjoy the story together and know who they are. Furthermore, the series in question was uploaded way back then. I cannot expect folk to sit through 10 to 15 hours of dark fantasy content just to know who one character is. And of course, this is for YouTube purposes only. When I publish my books, the written form of storytelling will not have such recaps or lore breakdowns. Anyway, do forgive me, I digress. This is how the White Wolf met the Elven Archer. And until the next one, do take care. Chapter 1. The Harrow Monster. Dark clouds gathered over the village of the Harrow that afternoon. They looked ominous but not as frightening as what lurked inside the village. Folk heard strange noises coming from the Harrow, a once beautiful village with trees between the wooden houses. The village lake used to be a place of comfort and relaxation. However, 1 year ago everything changed. Now there was a wall made of decayed limbs piled on top of each other. Bones, stacked so high that it could topple over if one pushed hard enough. Bones belonging to the previous villagers that lived there. Outside folk said the monster living in the village cave was responsible. An 8-foot-tall beast with white fur and glowing red eyes. A monster whose teeth were so long and sharp that it could chew bone like sponge. A fiend who had razor-sharp claws that could slice through metal. But the bone fence blocking the west entrance of the Harrow was not the only blockade. To the east, there was a stone wall so tall it seemed to touch the clouds. No one knew how and when it was built, only that a graveyard existed beyond it, seen through the cracks and crevices, of course. And still, rumor has it that even the ghosts are afraid to lurk the graveyard at night, solely because of the monster behind the stone wall. However, there was such a person who didn't seem to be afraid to enter the village. Folk had witnessed a short warrior entering the Harrow from the north, which was the opposite end of the village lake. The route to the north was rather peculiar and secretive. The mountain pass was a dangerous choice of travel, especially when covered in seasonal snow. The path seemed to disappear at first, but very few had knew that it led to the land of Freya, home to the dwarves. That explained the man entering the village of Harrow, for he was a dwarf, but not just any ordinary dwarf. This was Berthold, the tallest dwarven warchief who stood at 5'5", and he was proud of it. He wore strong, heavy dwarven armor that looked like it weighed a ton, though the dwarf's body seemed to carry it just fine. Berthold was a buff dwarf with arms and legs like tree trunks, but his belly was large from all the ale. He had a single blade axe attached to the left side of his hip, while another strapped to his back. His dark brown thick beard was so long that his mouth was barely visible. His long brown hair touched his shoulders as it blew in the strong wind. Not an ounce of fear or hesitation in the dwarf's stride, rather jovial and carefree. Folk yelled from afar, "Get away, you fool!" But Berthold greeted them with a wave of his large hand, thinking they were calling out to him in kind. No, he was not afraid to walk in the harrow, nor was he scared of who resided inside that cave. For that monster the land had feared was his dear friend who he was paying a visit to. That beast that struck horror in the souls of many was none other than Ragnar Liefsson. Chapter 2: The Elf Party. After an hour, Berthold left the cave of the harrow. He was saddened by the state his friend was in. Ragnar Liefsson was driven by nothing but revenge. His heart had turned to stone, and the coldness of his soul chilled the cave more so than the night breeze ever could. Still, he showed the love and respect that he had for the dwarf, his oldest friend. Berthold would not use the same path back home. The mountainous pass was an easier route downhill. Therefore, he chose to travel by boat from the Harrow Lake, making his way around the town of Houndsville, then heading west towards Redwater. Houndsville was the land of werewolves, but Berthold wasn't afraid of them. If anything, natural-born werewolves in that town should be petrified of the dwarf. Many mistake his jovial, loud nature for mockery, but the dwarven war chief was not one to trifle with. After all, his reputation of being the most barbaric warrior came from the countless battles he had fought in. Once he entered Redwater, he would bypass the towns and villages and then make his way towards the forest. From there, he would have to travel true north, back home to the land of Freya. This route had a gentler terrain that was more forgiving on the dwarf's body. However, while he trod through the forest, he caught a glimpse of something that startled him. There was a party of elves inside the forest. How strange, he had thought. Elves had not graced this land for more than a century, but now they were here in Redwater. 3 male elves and 3 female elves, which was rather strange. Elf parties always moved in larger numbers, no less than 25. Berthold looked at his worn-out armor and touched his beard. He felt dirty, unclean, and unkempt, while they looked magical. They had long silky hair, even the male elves, while all had worn their tunic-style robes. Their attire was more evergreen than the foliage. Their skin like porcelain, not a single mark or scratch. Their pointy ears and petite bodies made them look like magical creatures sent from above. It was quite peculiar for a dwarf to see elves in that light. The feud between elves and dwarves existed long before that of werewolves and vampires. Berthold always felt that quarrel was rather foolish. He was the first dwarf not to lead an attack on the elves, for there was no reason to. He broke their generational curse and stigmatism, hoping to one day form an alliance with them. However, that was wishful thinking. The elves in front of him inside this maze of a forest might not share the same views. Berthold approached them slowly, wary of their long bows and quivers filled with arrows. Though they never attacked him, and so he frowned. Something was fishy. 5 elves turned to look at him as they placed their right hand on their chest, bowed down on one knee, and gently moved their head in acknowledgement. Usually, if these were normal elves, Berthold would have had 100 arrows stuck in his body by now. The dwarf looked closer after returning the greeting gesture, only to find one of the elves was severely wounded. The dwarf rushed to the elf's aid, using his own methods and dwarven techniques to stop the bleeding. The wound on the she-elf's leg was indeed bad, and when Berthold looked behind the large tree, he saw the creature that attacked them. It was a natural-born werewolf. Werewolves that looks like normal wolves, only much, much larger. The creature had at least 20 arrows stuck in its body. Berthold then looked at the tallest elf and asked, "Forgive me, laddie, but what are you doing so far away from elvish lands?" The male elf introduced himself as Ebonor, an exceptional archer and second in command in the current elf party. Ebonor then replied, but his voice was no more than a whisper, so soft and warm like a melodic lament. "Well, Master Dwarf, we have been exiled." Chapter 3: The Land of Freya. "Exiled?" Berthold exclaimed. "Why?" "We have followed our elf lord, Master Dwarf. She's more than 1,000 years old, and her wisdom is something we hope to obtain a fraction of one day. She refused to lead the attack on your home. Our elf lord believes this feud between elves and dwarves has gone on for too long. She wishes to meet the dwarf in charge of the land of Freya, hoping to forge an alliance. She believes that if we combine elvish and dwarven resources and craftsmanship, we could face any threat the land may bring us. Though we know not where she is. She set out to get food and help with directions, but I fear she may be lost." That statement would normally sound bizarre, but Berthold understood. The forest in Redwater was so large with trees so tall that anyone could get lost. Elves have exceptional eyesight, maybe even close to a supernatural level, but that would mean they would have to climb the tallest tree in this forest just to find their way. Berthold said, "Aye lad, you're in luck, for I am the leader of dwarves and the land of Freya is my home." The dwarf moved his left hand towards his axe, but before even touching the handle, he had 5 elves pointing 5 arrows at him. They were so quick in drawing an arrow in their bow that it seemed almost impossible, much like vampiric speed. The dwarf raised his hands in surrender and said, "Whoa, slow down, dear elves. My axe this time is not for battle." Then he removed it from the hip harness and pointed the blade to the ground. The elves released the tension of their bowstrings, absolutely bewildered at what the dwarf was trying to do. Berthold then drew a rough map on the forest floor with symbols and simple landmarks showing the elves the way to the land of Freya. "Do forgive us," Ebonor said, "though we cannot leave our elf lord behind." "Aye," the dwarf replied, "that I understand." He looked up at the dark clouds bursting with rain and felt the gust of strong wind blowing through his hair. "But you cannot stay here," he continued. "Werewolves and vampires would soon storm the forest, and your arrows will do no good in these strong winds. Do heed my request and make haste to my home. I hear elves are extremely light on their feet, which means the path ahead would be easier for all of you, even with your injuries," he said. Berthold told the elves that when they reach the stone fortress at the gate, announce his name and tell his people that he sent them. They will serve the elves a hearty meal to warm their bellies and give them proper lodgings for the night. "Fear not, laddie," Berthold said. "I will find your elf lord and return with her to the land of Freya. You have my word." With that, the elves bowed in farewell and Berthold did the same, though as they turned away the dwarf had asked, "Lad, by the way, what is your elf lord's name?" And so the elf responded, "Eleanor. Her name is Eleanor." Chapter 4: Eleanor the Elf Lord. Berthold traveled throughout Redwater in the pouring rain, asking nearby folk if they had seen an elf wandering these parts. The true weight of his armor had now begun taking its toll. More so, Redwater at the time had witches living in secrecy, hiding from hunters. The dwarven warrior never feared much, but witches were always folk that he was quite petrified of. He always thought they would cast a spell on him, then turn him into a pig to be cooked and eaten. Nevertheless, there was no sign of the elf lord. He had given his word to the elf party, and a dwarf never, ever goes against their word. Although, Berthold had a look of worry on his face. When he spoke to the elf party, he noticed they kept looking towards the west. The west was never a good place to travel to, especially at night. The city of Cascada was forbidden to all kinds of folk, except one. But then Berthold saw the elf lord walking aimlessly out the forest at the west end. The dwarf felt a strange sensation over his body. His fingers felt heavy, his heart calm, but beating non-existently. This elf that his eyes had the blessing of glancing upon was the most beautiful person he had ever seen in his entire long dwarven life. It was the long pointy ears and the bow that gave her away. However, the elf lord was smart enough to hide her elven attire by wearing a dirty, dark hooded cloak, though the hood was off and her silky white hair was pushed inside the hooded compartment of the cloak. It's not that Berthold didn't find dwarven women beautiful because they were, but there was something different about the she-elf. It wasn't her pink lips, porcelain skin, thick black eyelashes above and below the eyes that smitted him so. Rather, it was the feeling that he felt in his soul. That calmness and warmth, like the she-elf was not just a partner to court, but a person that felt like home. However, in finally feeling what falling in love was like, that moment was short-lived, for the dwarf's eyes widened in fear and disbelief. The elf seemed to be so lost in thought that she was heading towards the city behind the west gate. The dwarven warrior ran as quickly as he could, but Eleanor had already entered the city. He reached the west gate made of solid steel and gently opened it, trying his best not to make a noise, though the elf was nowhere in sight. And so the dwarf entered the quiet city in the west, known as Cascada, home to vampires. Chapter 5: The Vampire City. Eleanor moved like she weighed less than a feather. However, in the city, something was certainly off about it. Her footsteps felt loud and her breathing intrusive. The eerie, unnatural silence sent a chill down her spine. There were no dogs or cats, no drunkards or beggars roaming the narrow streets, no wind chimes or flapping shutters. The she-elf looked at how strange the houses and buildings looked. Sure, they were made of stone, but it looked blackened from either age or stained blood. There were needle-like roofs on almost every structure, and all the windows were boarded shut with wooden planks. The city felt like a ghost town. When Eleanor walked into a narrow, darkened alleyway, she heard footsteps approaching behind her. There were also sounds of hissing, which she interpreted to be creatures of some sort. Then, 4 bald men, paler than a gloomy day, had walked towards her while she backed up against the stone wall. She spoke, her voice like a gentle kiss and soothing as a lullaby. "What have you done to the people in this town?" she asks. But the human-like creatures in front of her had no intention of talking. They were thirsty for blood. Their fangs pushed out their mouths, and then they dashed forward towards the she-elf. But this incident lasted for no more than a few seconds. The 4 bald men were on the ground with an arrow each stuck in their heart. Elves were exceptional archers, but Eleanor was in a league of her own. But she couldn't keep her bow or her arrows away just yet. She heard heavy footsteps approaching the alley corner, armor clanking with every stride, followed by breathing from a set of lungs that sounded like they were collapsing. So she readied an arrow, waiting to fire, but was caught off guard by the height she aimed for. In front of her partially stood Berthold, hands on his knees, back slouched, panting like an animal. "We have to get out of here," the dwarf said in an urgent whisper. "It's not safe for any of us." Eleanor pointed her arrow away from Berthold's head and said no. "These creatures have emptied out this land. They have done something of great evil to this place." "No," Berthold responded. "This is their land, she-elf. These men on the ground are vampires." Berthold paused for a moment, observing the arrows through the hearts of the fallen vampires. Forget the arrows finding their target, but it was close to impossible to graze a vampire, let alone kill them. The fact that the elf's eyes kept up with the vampire movements were astonishing and frightening to say the least. Then Eleanor said, "But the city is empty." She phrased it more as a question than a statement. "Aye," Berthold said, "this time of year vampires enter their deep slumber. Not a single sound would wake them up, but there are guards patrolling the city, creatures of the night they are, keeping a watchful eye on the rest. You've just met 4 of them. There are about 100 more." Truer words could not have been spoken, for at the entrance of the alleyway, the vampire creatures had gathered. They hissed and growled, while their sharp fangs and razor-sharp fingernails glistened in the shadows. "What do we do now?" Eleanor asked. Berthold removed the axe from his hip, holding it tight in his right arm, while he unhooked the other, strapped to his back. "We fight our way out," he said. And so, in a time of great peril, and in a matter of life or death, elf and dwarf fought alongside each other, unknowingly forming an alliance that would not only last forever, but change the dynamics of the continent. Berthold swung his axes like large cleavers, dodging and weaving with every offensive and defensive attack, respectively. Eleanor fired her arrows with seemingly no effort. Vampire creatures did indeed fall, but more and more gathered at the entrance of the alleyway. Vampires were now closing the distance, and elf and dwarf had their backs pressed against the cold stone wall. Eleanor counted 70 of them, but they were indeed more, obstructed by the narrow alley walls. Such a fleeting moment, Berthold had thought. His meeting with the she-elf would be short-lived, a mere dream he hoped to carry into the afterlife. However, both elf and dwarf looked deep into each other's eyes, gave a vague nod, and tightened the grip on their respective weapons. They would fight these creatures to the death. But then, they heard the steel gate, now to the east of them, slowly squeak open. Then the vampires at the alleyway entrance all looked towards the steel gate at the same time. In a shocking turn of events, the vampire creatures began backing away, moving west, past the alleyway and out of sight of the elf and dwarf. "What's happening?" Eleanor asked. Berthold never answered, as he was just as confused. Hesitantly, one of the vampire guards ran at the speed of light, passing across the alley entrance heading towards the steel gate. However, the vampire's head had soon traveled in the air, from the steel gate back to the part the creature had come from. The elf's eyes widened as the dwarf grabbed her hand and nudged her towards the entrance. "We can use this chance to get away," he whispered. Berthold held his axe in front, pointing it at the vampires, while elf and dwarf had finally exited the alley. But the elf lord wasn't looking at the vampires. Her widened eyes were feasting on a giant monster, more frightening than anything that could haunt and plague her nightmares. An 8-foot-tall werewolf slowly walks through the open steel gate. Though he isn't hunched like a monster, his scapula is retracted, his shoulders broad and strong, and his thunderous feet shake the ground ever so slightly. His red eyes pierce through Eleanor's soul, as the elf lord is oblivious to the fact that the warrior knight turned werewolf had just entered the city of vampires. Chapter 6. Ragnar Liefsson. The elf and dwarf stood back to back. Berthold faced the direction of blood-thirsty vampires, while Eleanor faced this monstrosity walking towards her. Ragnar, the white wolf, walked slowly and carefully, but the carefulness did not stem from fear. The strong winds ruffled his white fur, unable to blow away his stoic expression. The elf lord grabbed an arrow from her quiver and readied it. However, in Eleanor's long elvish life of being the best archer that ever graced the earth, her hands trembled. Berthold was unaware of her actions, for he was dealing with a horde of hesitant vampire creatures in front. Ragnar walked towards Eleanor, completely shunning the vampires in Cascada like they weren't formidable enough to even look at. When he reached the elf lord, he bent forward, pressing his forehead against the cold steel arrowhead. And then he spoke.
"Aim for the head, she-elf,"
he said.
"Try and put me out of my misery."
The elf dropped her bow while the arrow fell to the ground clumsily, a trait that wasn't shared with elves. "No, it cannot be," she says, her expression petrified. Berthold said, "He's a friend, she-elf." "I will explain." However, Berthold's sentence was cut off, for Eleanor said, "You're a special class werewolf." Ragnar and Berthold frowned. When the vampires grew impatient, their foolish naivety allowed them to take a few steps forward. But the white wolf growled as his red eyes seemed to glow. His aura emanated immense pressure, almost a suffocating feeling pressing down on their shoulders. These vampires hid from him when he was a human, a warrior knight taking monster contracts and fighting in battles. If they feared their chances of survival back then, what could they possibly do now? With their sharp fangs and long fingernails, they backed away completely, allowing the elf, dwarf, and werewolf to walk out the city of Cascada. Then the trio made their way back to the forest. It was midnight and the elf and dwarf had almost met their demise. A little time to reflect and calm their nerves wouldn't hurt anyone. More so, with Ragnar at their side, no creature human-like or supernatural would be dumb enough to approach them. Thankfully, the canopy in the Redwater forest was so dense that most of the fallen tree logs and branches were untouched by the rain. And so, Berthold got a fire going while Ragnar carried 3 tree logs like they weighed close to nothing, then placed them around the fire as seating arrangements. Eleanor, using her elvish eyes and spectacular archery skills, managed to get a deer from miles away, with Berthold then preparing a meal over the fire for his companions. Eleanor grimaced, trying not to throw up. "Eat," Berthold said. "You've traveled so far without any food." Eleanor then removed a biscuit from her pocket. It was no more than the length and width of an average finger. She nibbled on the biscuit, saying, "This will suffice, Master Dwarf. We elves do not eat much." With elf, dwarf, and werewolf sitting around a small fire, Berthold asked the burning question. "Eleanor," he said, almost shy that he spoke her name, "what do you mean by Ragnar being a special class werewolf?" Eleanor finished eating the biscuit, dusting off the crumbs from her lap. Her eyes were fixed on the white wolf, in absolute awe of the specimen in front of her. "I cannot believe it," she says, "but now that I see it with my elvish eyes, the prophecy is true." The elves were the only race in the land that were viewed and deemed to be all-knowing, since they were the oldest. "Oh, is that so?" Berthold said. "Then respectfully, she-elf, how did you not know those bald men were vampires?" "Because those are not the vampires that originated from this land," she replied. "We know of them to look and to move differently." Ragnar spoke, and it startled Eleanor. She had not yet gotten used to his deep, menacing, monstrous voice.
"Elves have not walked this land for more than a century. What are you doing here?"
And so the elf lord explained while Berthold backed her up by telling the white wolf of the elf party.
"Very well,"
Ragnar said.
"If Berthold sees you as an ally, then I will too."
From ancient history to prophecies and bestiaries, they obtained knowledge like no other. The dwarf then politely asked Eleanor about the prophecy of the land, her knowledge of monsters, and Ragnar being a special class werewolf. "Very well then," she replied. "Where shall I begin?" Chapter 7. Vampires. Eleanor's inability to recognize the vampires in Cascada can certainly be excused, for vampires were rather different creatures when she was just a little elf. Long ago, there was a plague that struck the land that affected animals, but mostly bats. The chemicals in the air, when exhaled, altered the bats' DNA, transforming them into nightmarish creatures. Some said the plague itself was unnatural, siding more towards a curse put on the land. The bats grew almost 15 times their size, terrorizing towns and villages patrolling the skies at night. They became rabid monsters, driven by a bloodlust which led them to insanity. When the elves got word of these night creatures, an army was led to exterminate the vampires and keep human folk safe. It was also documented that whichever human these vampire creatures fed on would transform into the bat-like creature by the next nightfall. The elves fought bravely, but they were outnumbered, resorting to elvish intelligence to dictate the outcome of the battle. At that point in time, the vampire creatures moved at the speed of light, and their weakness was not yet known. However, when the elves soared through the air, leaping from rooftop to rooftop, their eyes witnessed the greatest weakness of these creatures. At dawn, when the sun pierced the sky, the vampires began burning and bursting into flames. Some of the bat-like creatures, the stronger ones, did not share such a similar fate. While their skin did burn, their bodies turned to ash without disintegrating, rather freezing them like statues. These statues today are known as gargoyles. Folk today regard them as spooky spectators of their towns and villages. But if one looks close enough, one would see the gargoyles' fangs and glowing red eyes peek through the ashen stone. Many years later, every land was free from those vampire creatures until the gods cursed a human, a faithful man that used to be a priest. He was one of the wisest, if not the most powerful priest that walked the earth. With his mere words and knowledge of the darkness, he would exorcise demons, sending them back to hell. In some cases, when the exorcism did not work, the priest would don his silver brass knuckles, anointed with holy oil, and physically beat up demons with his own hands. Then one day, a demon orchestrated the perfect plan against the priest. Why not give him a taste of the demon blood that he expels with ease? And so, despite knowing the priest would destroy the demon, the creature spat blood onto the priest's face before being sent into the shadows. Unknowingly and unintentionally, the priest swallowed some of the droplets of blood that made it into his mouth. Days passed and the nights grew darker, while the craving for blood intensified. Frightened and ashamed, the priest stood in front of the goddess Noctera, confessing his sin. Noctera, the moon goddess, was furious with the crime her most loyal servant had committed. In her rage during a blood moon, a time of great omens and a harbinger of death, Noctera cursed the priest to be a blood-drinking monster like the bat creatures in before's time. There was no description of the priest in terms of physicality in any book inside the Elven library, but there was a name: Nazduk, meaning forsaken or the forgotten. That's all Eleanor knew of vampires, since the stories of Nazduk, the vampire priest, vanished from the elvish lands just as quickly as they were created. Now the Elf Lord has witnessed it firsthand that the species of vampire has traveled to human DNA, something she greatly feared. Nevertheless, no vampire would ever be quick enough to avoid or dodge the Elf Lord's arrows. Furthermore, as long as there is sunlight, vampires would never win their battle, as light, seen as pure and life-giving, chases away that of darkness, seen as impurity and death. However, if the vampire monster DNA has mixed with human DNA, who knows just how much more these vampiric creatures could transform. Chapter 8. Werewolves. Natural-born werewolves have been common knowledge in every land, not only in this continent but all the others as well. The elves, however, being the oldest race in the world, know of two more categories of werewolf. Nevertheless, Eleanor began with the first class or grade. Natural-born werewolves are human men born with lycanthropy. It began as a curse, but the generational passing down is merely genetic. These men transform into large wolves during the presence of a full moon, and only then. This transformation is excruciating, having their bones dislocate and sometimes break to mold into the creature that comes out at night. Natural-born werewolves most of the time pose no threat to human folk. They hunt and feed on animals while living in secrecy and isolation. Natural-born werewolves tend to find each other, forming a pack and protecting their home, i.e. Houndsville, the land of werewolves. Many telltale signs exist, such as abnormal hair growth, a unibrow, sharp teeth, dirt caked under fingernails, and a specific wolf-like odor from their bodies. These werewolves cannot and will not be bipedal creatures. With sometimes the exception of an alpha, they remain moving like normal wolves. Furthermore, they do not retain any of the human memories when transformed, only the animalistic instincts and law of their hunting code and pack. Then there's cursed werewolves, which aren't widely known across the land with the exception of witches, since they were the ones responsible for creating such monsters. Cursed werewolves do not have a natural transformation, which means they are not born with lycanthropy, rather forced into it with false bravado and the belief of tremendous power. Witches conjure up potions, ointments, and spells to trigger this monstrous change. And since these men have already sold their souls to the dark forces, either through rituals or cult-like practices, they blindly accept. The ointments and potions only work at night irrespective of a full moon. Since metabolism is the lowest at night, these ointments take over the body by penetrating the skin follicles. However, when they transform into werewolves, they do not feel pain, as the potions mask the physical sensation that comes with it. Witches use these men to carry out their dirty deeds without getting their own hands dirty. Much like natural-born werewolves, cursed werewolves retain no memories from their human life, only their goal, mission, or task at hand given to them by the witch. They pose a great threat to humanity, not just in werewolf attacks and feeding rituals, but also in the manipulation of other human folk to follow the same procedures. However, unlike natural-born werewolves, cursed werewolves are far stronger creatures from the dark magic, and they are bipedal. They are rabid, fiercer, and driven by bloodlust. Then there are the special class werewolves, a category only known by the elves, heaven, and hell. Much like a cursed werewolf, the transformation only occurs through an incantation, not cast by a witch, rather by a demon. A portion of the demon's power performing the incantation is then transferred to the werewolf. Hence, the stronger the demon, the stronger the werewolf. These werewolves are always bipedal. They are more humanoid, not hunched like monsters, and are levels ahead in power and speed. Demons need these type of creatures in hell, not only to wage battles against humanity, but aid in the destruction of heaven. They are mindless beasts, easy to control, easy to manipulate, and poisoned to carry out orders in the underworld. Though, that aspect doesn't make them special, rare, or unique. The term special class instead came from breaking the incantation. 9 out of 10 times the one being cursed loses their mind and soul to the demon. But in that one time, the curse is either reversed to some extent or severely altered. If the one being cursed is strong enough to hold onto their memories and purpose, their mind isn't lost in the transformation process, thus allowing them to still speak fluently in their monster form. The only downside of the incantation is these werewolves can never revert to their human bodies, be it day or night, full moon or not. They are stuck in that werewolf form much like Ragnar Liefsson. Hell no, any demon will have control over a special class werewolf, no matter how many times they may try. Unlike natural-born and cursed werewolves, special class werewolves do not share a weakness for silver. The only way to defeat them is to take their head off, something that many have tried to do to Ragnar, and many have failed. However, with that being said, the reason special class werewolves were not common knowledge was due to the rarity of such a case. Special class werewolves were only mistakenly created if the prophecy was meant to come to light. Chapter 9. The Prophecy of the Land. There was once a prophecy that was written by the angel Jorah, a scribe and a loyal servant in the kingdom of heaven. However, her loyalty wavered when she meddled in the underworld. There was a young demon war chief who fell in love with Jorah, thus manipulated by him, changing the course of events the land would experience. Zalzar, the demon war chief, convinced Jorah that the creation of human folk was the biggest mistake in the universe. Angels, however, wanted to protect the land and mankind, while demons wanted to destroy it. Jorah then wrote a prophecy on an ancient stone tablet that would create monsters to battle against the angel army, monsters known as special class werewolves. Heaven did not know about Jorah's prophecy for a while, and when they did, they cast her out of heaven along with 9 other angels that committed treason in aiding in the destruction of humanity. These fallen angels were known as the Velzari, meaning banished or simply the fallen. Though they were cast out, the Velzari retained their angelic powers, but now worked for the domain of hell. The angels in heaven were unaware that Jorah had in fact taken the tablet with her, thus having the ability to write prophecies into existence. Through eons, the battles between angels and demons destroyed Earth more than once. Timelines were changed, life forms were altered, but the prophecy remained the same. Until one day, a young man who never skipped a day's prayer was spied upon by the fallen angel Jorah. She used him and manipulated him the same way Zalzar had done to her, convincing him to be a weapon in the destruction of hell. This young, innocent man was none other than Belru Caesar. Belru, unaware that Jorah was not a real angel anymore and blinded by his fate, chose to go forth with a plan. A demon would come down to the land and curse a man to be a werewolf, a mindless creature that would serve hell and build a monster army in the land. Jorah, however, told Belru not to worry, as he would retain all of his memories and infiltrate the domain of hell as one of their own. This was a lie, of course, as the prophecy stated nothing of the sort. But Jorah did not realize that her angelic powers were slowly being cast away from her damned soul. In turn, her spoken word, be it truth or lie, be it what she wanted or not, would be engraved into the stone tablet. Hence, Belru Caesar, the first special class werewolf, was born, just as the altered make-believe version of the prophecy Jorah had spoken into existence. With Belru indeed retaining his speech, memories, and mannerisms, he did infiltrate hell, decreasing the numbers of demons from the inside. The elves know not of the events that followed, for Belru Caesar was turned to stone on an island near this continent. And still, the elvish records mention him being the strongest cursed being in all of existence. Hence the demons turned him into stone, unable to kill him. But these demons were not part of Zalzar's clan. Rumor has it that 3 old men masquerade as wizards, pretending to only know magic. But the elves have reason to believe that the Wizards of 3 are actually the first demons in the domain, Asmodeus, Belial, and Beelzebub, which explains why they were strong enough to defeat Belru and freeze him for all of eternity. Now here's where things become rather interesting and terrifying. While not recorded in lore, some of the elves claim to know on how the prophecy had changed. Though this is mere speculation and should be taken with a grain of salt, some say Belru rewrote the prophecy before he was exiled, almost like he knew that he would lose the fight back then, but not the battle. He spoke the change of events into the tablet. 2 other special class werewolves would be born. One to dismantle the underworld and all the powerful beings that control it. The other to be worthy enough to find the stone tablet, rumored to be inside a jungle, freeing Belru from the statue and aiding in the fight against evil. The elves also mentioned that Jorah got word of what Belru was trying to do at the time, thus implementing the werewolf trials tied to the stone tablet. That's all that she could change from Belru's prophecy, just before the tablet lost all connection to her. The werewolf trial states that hell would only be destroyed if Jorah was defeated, a bold claim made by the fallen angel, now the demon queen of hell. She's confident that she cannot be beaten, and the one who could come close has been turned to stone. So you see, Ragnar, Eleanor said, you are part of the prophecy. This gives me hope that we can win. What do you mean? Berthold asked. The Elf Lord explained that prophecies are either a hit or a miss. Most of the time they're fables told around a fire, as the trio have been doing. But one thing was indeed certain. Whether 3 werewolves of special class were born or not, monsters will come to the land and destroy it and claim humanity. It happened before and it will happen again. History has a habit of repeating itself. That is why Eleanor wishes to form an alliance with the dwarves. United, they can face the monster army heading towards the land. If more elves from the elvish lands receive word of how wrong they've been about dwarves, they could coexist, having the best warrior army ever seen. Elves for distance with their archery skills, dwarves for their barbaric, ruthless close combat techniques, and now an 8-foot-tall warrior knight turned werewolf, who was more frightening and powerful the elf had ever seen, would make the strongest alliance that ever existed. Then the elf and dwarf bid farewell to the white wolf, as Berthold would now take Eleanor to the place that would be her home for the rest of her long elvish life. However, a great distance away, the trio had been watched for all this time by a being that has power like no other. Chapter 10. The Grim Reaper. Death closed his long spyglass and kept it away in his pocket. He stood on a mountaintop wearing his long black hooded cloak and scythe in hand. But he wasn't alone. Strapped and restrained to a rock was a demon known as Behemoth. The monster's legs were sliced off by the grim scythe, and that wasn't the scariest thing to happen on the mountain pass. The Reaper began picking up limbs from the ground and packing them away into a large sack. From hands, legs, fingers, toes, heads, even teeth, the Reaper made sure he picked up every last piece. Death always cleaned up the mess that he made, for those slaughtered limbs lying on the ground were caused by his scythe. The demon Behemoth led an attack against the land, an attack that wasn't passed through hell. None of them expected Death to be there. While he continued picking up limbs from the ground, the demon spoke.
Why keep me alive, Reaper? For your amusement. You've slaughtered my fiends with so much ease. Why not deal the same fate to me?
The Grim Reaper hummed a tune the entire time, then walked towards Behemoth and flicked the demon's nose. He repeated what the demon said in a mocking type of way, then answered, "Oh, I could dismember you, you know, and I wouldn't need my scythe to do so. I could use my bare skeletal hands and have a field day with you. However, I need you. I need you to deliver a message for me."
I'll tell them, you know. If you send me back to hell, I'll tell them that you interfered with the lives of humans. I'll tell them it was you who forged the alliance between elves and dwarves. You changed the signs of the towns and villages just so the elves could get lost. You led the elf party to the Red Water Forest because that's where the dwarf was heading. You created a storm to wake up the White Wolf, knowing he would hear the commotion of vampires in Cascada and see the elf party traveling to the land of Freya. I'll tell them everything.
Death sat in front of Behemoth with his legs crossed, his cloak blowing and flapping in the strong winds. And then he applauded. "You know, Behemoth," he said, "I've always taken you to be a dumbass, but that was brilliant. Truly and utterly brilliant. That actually saves me half of my monologue.
Yes, you dumbwit, that is exactly what I want you to do. You will drag your demon body through the fiery pits of hell, what's left of it anyway, and you tell them everything that I've done here today. Oh, and the sack with the remains of your underlings. You drag that along with you and show it to my siblings. You tell famine, war, and conquest everything, okay? Oh, and before I forget, also tell them that because you broke the rules of natural law, no demon can ever walk this land for the next 100 years. Tell them that because of your malice, you have pushed back the demon's plans by a century. Suddenly, the half-bodied behemoth was not smiling anymore. He would rather be slain by the hand of death himself than to tell Zelda that they would have to wait 100 years because of him. Death got up to his feet and told the demon that he would be right back. After a blink, the Reaper was already in front of him, like he never left in the first place. The Grum then cut the restraints of the demon and dragged him to the edge of the cliff. Below, in what seemed to be a freefall into the abyss, had a jagged slash through the earth. Slightly visible from above, Behemoth saw the flames bursting and lava crashing into the fiery pits. And so, Death tossed the demon off the cliff, followed by the sack containing dismembered limbs. The demon's scream of anguish and despair was soon silenced when he fell through the portal of hell. As the Grim Reaper snapped his fingers closing the portal, he walked away into the mountainous fog and whispered to himself, "So it begins."